Kaya, hello, and Wodju. Welcome to everyone joining us today for Perth NRM's Coastal Forum for 2020. It looks a little different this year, but it's an exciting time. We've been able to engage a couple of fantastic speakers for you, one of whom is coming to us live from the East Coast. So my name is Hannah Gulliver, and I'm a passionate coastal advocate, a beach lover, and a diver. I'm lucky enough to work for Perth NRM as a coastal and marine manager alongside the lovely Kate Spatori, and together, and with great support from the rest of the Perth NRM team, we support our stunning Perth Metro coastline, our truly invaluable volunteers, and our local government land managers to both protect and to give a voice for the coast. In the last year, we've also been lucky to relaunch our Adopt a Beach program, run by professional education expert Wayne Walters. This program augments our on-ground outcomes by letting us engage with a new generation. This webinar is part of our coastal capacity building program, and it is funded through a Coastwest grant from the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, and we gratefully acknowledge their long-standing commitment to this program. Today, I am coming to you from our Perth office, and I am sitting on Wajak Noongar land. Nala Kadich, Wajak Mort, Kayan Karak, Nija Buja. I, the team at Perth NRM, and our presenters today acknowledge the Wajak Noongar peoples and ancestors as the traditional custodians of this land, which was never ceded. We value their connection to land, waters, and community. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands you are listening from today and pay our communal respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Thanks for sharing that with me. And before we get into the event, a little bit of housekeeping. We have quite a few of you on with us today. So we have muted your microphones and turned off your video, but this doesn't mean that we're not going to be interactive. We're going to start with a little fun question, which allows you to get the hang of it. So as you'll see on your screen, which of these statements best describes you? And this is all related to the coast. So the first one, I am a wave. I hate sand every time I hit the beach. I am a cliff. I look hard, but I protect what I love. I'm a mermaid or man. I never come out of the ocean. I'm a seagull. I'm just here for the chips. I'm driftwood. The ocean shapes who I am. And I can see we're starting to get some polls coming in. This is fantastic. So by far, we've got driftwood winning the game. Cliffs are coming up. Lots of people wanting to protect the coast. And we do have two people that are here, one for the chips and one that's eating sand every time they hit the beach. We still have a few people to go. I can see we've got 21 people logged in and it's building up. So we'll leave it for 1 minute more. Driftwood's winning. Excellent. I've chosen driftwood as well. Brilliant. 22 people. So again, if you are struggling and haven't opened up this form yet, it's www.menti.com. And this is again up the top of the screen that you can see on now. And the code is 357019. All right, it's looking like we've got a couple trickling in. 24, brilliant. Driftwood still winning. Got a couple of mermaid men. Brilliant. Now doing some quick math, it looks like all 24 have voted. So we might move on to the next one. Thank you very much for being a part of this. This is exciting. So our next one, we just want to gauge what audience we have with us today. So if you could choose what type of organisation you are from, and we'll come up with a pie chart. Brilliant. So our biggest mix today is non-governmental and community, mostly community. We have someone from state government here. We have a couple academics, it looks like, a couple business, and at least one who fits into the other category. We'll just give it a couple more seconds to see if that changes. And I'm so happy to see that we've got a lot of our community with us today. Looks like it's not moving, so we'll jump on to the next one. This one you can type in your response. So please type what organisation you are representing today. And if you are representing multiple, you can put both on there. You'll just have to do it in one answer. So before you submit, write both of them in there. Myself, good. Yanchep, lovely to see you here. Coburn, brilliant. Cottesloe, excellent. So For Blue, that's one of our presenters today. Got business, Perth NRM Teal Solutions. NAC, hello to our northern neighbours. Fauna Reef, so Friends of North Ocean Reef and Aluka Foreshore. We're getting a good spread of the Perth Metro coastline. Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, who our grant was through. Mandurah Environment Group, lovely to see our southern neighbours in there. Malgamongup, lovely to have you. Another Cottesloe. Coastal Waste Warriors in Mandurah as well, lovely to have you. Oh, brilliant. Understory on RTR FM 92.1, Radio for the Planet. Brilliant to have you here. Friends of Island Point. City of Canning. Brilliant. We've got a nice spread and welcome to everyone. So thank you for joining us. We'll move on to the next question. So we've gauged who we have with us today. Next, we'd like to gauge what you're expecting from today. We want to make this a really worthwhile session. So let us know what would make today's session really worthwhile for you. And I understand this might take you a little while to type. Not sure, that's totally fine. We want to, I'm sure you will get value out of it, no matter what you're expecting. Chips. Chips might be something you have to get post-forum, or you can grab them now if you want to eat. There's no video, so we can't watch you popping them in your mouth. Not sure, we're getting that a bit, and that's fine. We're here for a few different reasons, and you'll get something out. So at the end of the session as well, we always like to get feedback. So we'll do that and make sure that we've met expectations that are there and see what expectations might be for the next one, knowing what this one had in it. So we've got big picture and more inspiration that kind of comes together. So what's next? Where do we go? More knowledge on coastal. Yep. So coastal issues, solutions, ability to review this session at a later date. Absolutely. So we'll be recording this session and you'll be able to access it on our website. Just here to learn. Brilliant. some exciting ideas, focusing on the WA coast and the people, getting an update, more ideas for successful engagement, absolutely, and Andrew will especially be speaking to some of that. Hearing how we can coax more people into becoming co-coordinators as our groups grow old, absolutely, succession planning. So Andrew will talk about youth. Where we at with climate change, and Tayanah, Dr. Tayanah will definitely speak to this. Protection of coastal birds, yes. Something practical and useful, yes. So we'll be able to find actions that we can actually put into place, or strategies for recruitment, and ways to engage different audiences, absolutely. So we'll look at opportunities to engage different audiences. And the last one, positive actions community members can take to care for our coast and oceans. Absolutely. That's what we're all here for. Everyone that signed on today has come in with the intent that we all want to look after our coast and oceans and looking for better ways to do that. So thank you very much for letting us know who's here and what you're expecting. And we will move on to some of our presenters. Just to let you know as well, so that's a fantastic interactive tool, and we'll be coming back to another session of this towards the end, but you can also interact on Zoom. So let's take a moment now. If you're on a phone, touch the screen. If you're on a computer, wiggle your mouse, and you'll see a couple of icons come up down the bottom. There's one that says chat, which I can see a few people have seen that works now. So if you click on that, it will come up down the side, and you can use this to chat to other people that are here. You can introduce yourself, and you can also, lovely, g'day David Dyke. You can also use this if you're having any difficulties. It means that our techies, they can help you sort this out and get you back in with sound or whatever you need. If you have questions though for our panelists or for us, could you please open up the Q&A box? So again, wiggle that mouse, press Q&A, and you'll see that you can type a question in here. You can also see other questions, so people's other questions. And if you see one that you want answered, you can click the little thumbs up symbol and it will bump this question up, and it means that I'm more likely to be able to ask these questions of our presenters in time. So love to see questions coming through, and you can use this throughout the presentations. So you don't need to hold on to your questions. You can type them out as soon as they come up. And the way we're rolling through it is we'll have a presentation, a short Q&A time for any burning questions, another presentation, similar format, and then we'll go into a workshop session, another survey, and open slather for questions so that we can ask all those burning questions of our presenters. And the first presenter, I'm very much looking forward to this. The first time I had a chat to Andrew Outhwaite a few weeks ago, he inspired me for a better future and a future for our coasts and oceans already. And Andrew actually started his coast-loving journey as an avid surfer who volunteered with our local Cambridge Coast Care. And he moved up north. He was an NRM coastal manager like myself with NAC, or the Northern Agricultural Catchment Council. And he is a passionate advocate for the health of coastal and marine systems. He's a global sustainability practitioner, and he has great faith in humanity learning. Andrew has spent the last 15 years growing ventures delivering social outcomes. These include, but are not limited to, reducing homelessness, promoting science and sustainability, growing healthy regional communities, and leading cultural transformation through innovation. Andrew is the founder of 4Blue, which works with ocean leaders to grow enriching blue economies and healthy marine ecosystems, especially in the Indian Ocean. So without further ado, what a journey. He's also been welcomed into the Cottesloe Coast Care Association's volunteer family recently too. So love that you're coming back to it on the grassroots action. Over to you, Andrew.
Okay, hi. Thank you very much, Kaya. Wanju. I'll turn my presentation, so be sharing my slides. So thank you very much for having me. I'm super excited to be here, and I'm going to talk about coastal caring. So look, one thing that comes to mind before I even sort of dive into this is just a sense of timescales, like this time and place, where we are now. Recently, there was a cave with 46,000 years of history destroyed in the north of our state, and that moment triggered in me a greater sense of responsibility than I've sort of had before, realizing that as an individual, a Western Australian, that whatever occurs in this state, whatever we do as a state or nation, or even as a humanity, there is some way in which I feel responsible. Doesn't mean I'm responsible for everything, but I'm responsible for my contribution to public debate, to caring for the places that I care about, for encouraging other people to step up and speak up as leaders, to pursue their passions and to care for each other, other species, future generations, and our oceans. And all of that is present in me now and possible for us now. And it may well be that our actions, or it is the case that our actions now will have implications for decades and centuries and millennia into the future, which I'm not taking as putting on as a burden or an obligation. It's just a brute fact of present experience. So I just wanted to say that to give a sense of time, that what we're doing now really matters. And what you are doing, whether in local government or state government or volunteer Coast Bear community members, we may not know how it's going to turn out, but what we do really, really matters. So today's forecast for the presentation. So the intention aligns with people's expectations, which is to provide a little bit of inspiration, talk about what I see as some fundamentals of innovation and how that may relate to coast care and our coastal and marine environments, and talk a little bit about practical action and what that might look like. So 4 things I'll cover in a couple of minutes each are just the evolution of my own guiding questions, so you get a sense of who I am and how I've arrived at these perspectives, and that may inform and resonate with your own experience. Where to focus, so getting a sense of where are we in time and space in Western Australia, and what does that mean for what we do. What to do, so talking about humans and innovations, and give some examples of different types of innovations that I've seen and that are relevant to this forum, and for who. So a really fundamental question is about for who are we doing what we're doing, and to talk about what that means in terms of practical action with some examples of a project I'm currently working on. So why? There's been a bit of an evolution of my why, and as mentioned, during high school would cycle from Wembley Downs down to City Beach, sometimes ridiculously early, to sleep in my board bag and wait for the waves to get a bit better or for the sun to come up before heading out for a surf for a short time, or on the weekends a really long time. And I came to really care for that part of the coast, which got me involved in Cambridge Coast Care. And in parallel to then studying science at university, was also learning a lot about leadership and community groups, and joined the Cambridge Coast Care Committee. And in my honours work at university, investigated the role of information and social systems in affecting landholder behaviour on the south coast of WA. So there's real interest in the intersection of human behaviour, human psychology, community groups, leadership, and our ecological environment. And that thread has sort of continued through. And recently, I see that I think Brett Del Pozo is on the call. I was flicking back through photos of Cambridge Coast Care at the time I was involved, and people like Kingsley Dixon, Robin Benkin, who I met at the time, remembering people like Kathy Ronalds and Martin Heller, who were involved in coordinating. Yeah, it really was a very, very significant formative sort of experience, that love for the coast. When I went on to work at Northern Agricultural Catchments Council, one of the challenges I felt there was this realisation that I'm not sure this is enough. I'm not sure if I keep working on coastal conservation and restoring dunes, that this is really going to be the difference that makes a difference. It always felt like I was behind, and that we were behind, and that we'd never get quite in front of the environmental problem. And so I was inspired to go, right, somewhere on Earth, someone must have figured out how to do this, how we can get in front of the global sustainability challenge. And so I went to Sweden to study strategic sustainability and leadership, and then went on to work in London in corporate sustainability half the time. Like, that was where I made money. And then the other half of the time working with startup social enterprises. So ventures that are both doing good for the world at the same time as making money, which seemed like a way that you could sort of make a better world without it being someone makes money and then someone has to fix up all the problems they've caused, in a sort of, you know, the mining versus conservation sort of sense of things, or the, you know, the pollution versus the cleanup sense of things. So this idea of social enterprises had great resonance, and that was fantastic working in Europe with really progressive corporate organisations and amazing social enterprises. It was an enormous system, and there was no beach. So I really felt compelled to come back to Australia, and felt a really strong commitment to spending 7 to 10, or about 7 years, I thought I'll say it's 10 years, in some location, some city, thinking that we really need to figure out this sustainability question on a community level. If we're going to create a global, society that is sustainable, that has to happen everywhere. If it's going to happen everywhere, it has to happen anywhere. And so I did a bit of a systematic analysis and a bunch of phone calls of all these Australian cities where I thought I could go and live and just see what contribution I could make to community sustainability. And actually, I selected Geraldton again, not only because of the waves, but because at the time they had a very progressive local government. There are a number of really innovative environmental and social organisations in the area. And it was sort of like an island out there, 450 kilometres north of Perth. So a fantastic place to do a sort of a long inquiry into the conditions that might be enabling of sustainable communities. So that led to forming Pollinators. I worked with the local government there for a while, and then formed Pollinators, which is a social enterprise that was committed to the mission of growing healthy, resilient, sustainable communities. So that took me into this whole world of startups and innovation. And after a while, including writing innovation strategies, so it's Pollinators, then expanding a number of other organisations, becoming the chairperson of the peak body representing startup organisations in Western Australia, working for the federal government, leading the funding and support of startup incubators. I was really drifting quite a lot away from my heart and my soul. And so started to get really curious again about what could Western Australia really do that would be good for the world? What are the opportunities for us not just to look after ourselves, but what contribution could we make globally? And so that led to this research into For Blue. So this brings me to the question of, where are we? So it's really interesting, I think, as people who love the coast, to consider where we are in the world. And rather than always look inland to institutions, to cities, to Canberra, consider that we're on the edge of the Indian Ocean, and we could look outwards towards the ocean and towards the surrounding 32 nations. More than anyone else, we're as much in the centre of the Indian Ocean as anyone. And in fact, Western Australia is recognised in the Indian Ocean as a leader and coordinator of multiple marine initiatives. We've previously been involved in the leaders of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. We coordinate international oceanographic scientific activities. We have institutions that run marine and coastal leadership programs in places like the Seychelles and Mauritius through UWA and Curtin. We really are recognised as a nation that has the resources and the expertise to take charge of many aspects of caring for the Indian Ocean. And that's not really something that Western Australians, I think about a lot, is what is our role in the ocean? What does it mean to turn westwards and look outwards? So the focus of this 4Blue report was looking at what's the intersection of Western Australia's capabilities, the opportunities in working with other nations for economic gain or social benefit around the Indian Ocean, and also what does the ocean need? So this report was released late last year, and what we looked at was 9 viable propositions. So what are some industries or foci, things we could do that are at the intersection of our expertise, what the ocean needs and what those Indian Ocean nations might benefit from. So one example of one of those areas is adaptation specialisation. So thinking, could we combine cultural approaches and disciplines to inform our approach to adaptation? Could Western Australians develop expertise in appropriately implementing strategies for ecosystems, industries and cities? So there's a number of local governments and researchers and practical projects in Western Australia that really are world leading in how we're starting to adapt to climate change and sea level change. And they go far beyond just thinking about infrastructure, but they do come to think about how we're going to adapt as cultures, as economies to the inevitable rise of the ocean. And that actually could in itself become an area of specialisation that we assist other nations with. And then we say, this is not just an emergency measure, but we are going to be facing rising sea levels for hundreds of years. It's an entire domain of area of expertise that we could be very good at. Another one to look at is oceanic identity. So querying, do we fully appreciate our significant dependence on the seas? Western Australia has the largest coastline in the Indian Ocean. Australia's 70% of our territory is actually underwater through our exclusive economic zone and other areas of ocean. 50% of our oxygen, every second breath, comes from the sea. 20% of our protein, in Perth, 20% of our fresh water. All of this comes from the sea. Western Australians, 95% of us live on the coast. But beyond sort of recreation and perhaps a relatively superficial relationship, do we really get how much we are dependent on the sea? Do we have festivals and cultural traditions? Do we wear clothes? Do we do things deliberately that recognise that we are, as Western Australians, an ocean-loving species? I think there's an opportunity. Sorry.
Just checking, and I love what you're saying here. If you were thinking of sharing a presentation, it hasn't come up. I don't know if you're speaking just as a video or you wanted to show your presentation with this now.
Okay, no, this is definitely meant to be sharing a presentation.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
That's all right. Your words have painted a beautiful picture anyway, and I'm sure we are feeling that as viewers. Sorry for technical difficulties, guys, but we'll start sharing that now.
Okay, sorry.
That's okay. Brilliant.
Okay.
Sorry to ruin your flow there.
That's perfect.
I'm
Thank you for
feeling
interrupting appropriately.
No worries.
So I'm going to run back through the slides very quickly.
No worries. I'll leave you.
Okay, so anyway, this is where we are in the Indian Ocean. And there's a report, and it's got fancy diagrams. And it talks about adaptation specialization and our oceanic identity and ecological stewardship. So oceanic identity, I think, is really important, and also ecological stewardship. So could we grow active ocean stewardship as an industry? So whether it's blue carbon or otherwise, there's lots of ways in which caring for the coast is actually like a legitimate economic activity. In the 2018 Australian Institute of Marine Sciences report on the value of the blue economy in Australia, that was the first year that marine tourism actually exceeded the value of oil and gas in terms of the contribution to Australia's economy. So caring for our ecological assets is actually a totally legitimate industry. Okay, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through, what do we do? So that all sounds great, Congratulations, Andrew. You've gone and answered some interesting questions and had some good adventures, and there's an interesting report about our position in the Indian Ocean. But what does that mean for what we should do as people working in local government or coast care groups? So there is this question that was posed to me about innovation, because across Europe, Australia, and recently in Asia, I've been working with a number of innovators and have started a number of social enterprises and innovations myself. And these really are at this intersection of what on the right-hand side, people, their pains and their gains and what jobs they have to get done. And then what can you provide that meets their needs, that relieves their pain, either as a product, a service, or otherwise. So an example of some different types of innovations, sometimes people come up with solutions, So I'm a mentor in a program at the moment that has called out globally for solutions to not just plastic pollution in Southeast Asia, but specifically knowing what data we have. So I'm working with two social enterprises, one in India and one in Sri Lanka, who are focused on the data of where the plastic waste is coming from as one of the steps that's necessary to help us manage the vast majority of the world's plastic pollution that comes from these 6 Southeast Asian nations. So they're very focused. This sort of plastic data challenge is similar to a challenge to solve homelessness that I was involved in the UK, where you run a competition and people are incentivized to provide solutions to that problem. Another sort of realm of innovation that's relevant to the marine and coastal environment is not running competitions to sort of solve problems at a systemic level, but thinking, what's a specific product or service that I can provide? So there's some amazing organizations in Perth that are very sort of early stage startups that are tackling, say, plastic pollution problems or other coastal management issues. And in fact, at Cottesloe Coast Care, I've seen a great innovation in terms of a product that helps dig holes for coastal planting. But there's also things like NOPLA, which is marine, which is biodegradable packaging that's actually made from marine organisms. So there's some amazing solutions that really close that loop. And they're turned into products, things that you can buy like an iPhone or different plastic packaging. A third area of innovation, and there are some really interesting ways that you can do this locally, is to create markets. So this means creating a situation where, whether it's blue carbon or carbon credits or even local currencies or micro incentives, that you can create a market where something that previously wasn't valued becomes valued. And there's many ways in which people are able to buy a hectare or take ownership of a piece of land or have their name on a tree that turns the environmental challenges we face into a market. So very different from a competition to solve a big problem or producing a particular product. You're innovating in terms of creating a market for something. I think the final level of sort of innovation I wanted to talk about was in values. So fundamentally, valuing something that wasn't valued before, or valued something we didn't know was valued. I think coast care is profoundly important, as it was for me, and I think for many others, in drawing attention to something that we otherwise take for granted. You know, before we turn it into being economically valued, before we turn it into products or solutions or fix it, there's just something fundamentally about recognizing something that needs to be cared for because it cares for us. I think this is much like the shift in consciousness when we first saw Earth from space. And that generated the impetus for creating Earth Day, because we recognized there was something there that we're part of that we hadn't really gotten before, but we really need to care for. So there are different types of innovations. I'd love to answer more questions about some of the details of the ones I've been involved in. But yeah, very briefly, there's some sort of high level thinking about different types of innovation. So now I want to just come to the who part, so about practical action. And I think this is very fundamental to whatever you think practical is to do. An example of a project I'm working on at the moment is to engage 15 to 24-year-olds in innovation for the future of our oceans as part of National Science Week. So our approach to that was to identify that there are probably very specific types of people that could be engaged in National Science Week. So we went from very broad down to 15 to 24-year-olds, and we almost went as narrow as 15 to 19-year-olds. But even in that demographic, we focused on these three different avatars, as we call them. So rather than trying to reach everyone, we decided to reach people that are creative and entrepreneurial, which we called the makers. And we have these whole detailed descriptions of who these people are and who their heroes are, what Facebook pages that they like, what schools they go to, what subjects they take. We also did the same for thinker tinkers. So these are more likely males who are at TAFE or university and who like engineering and science, but they may not necessarily have that affection and connection to the ocean, something that could be part of their career. The third were change makers who, for a range of ages and genders, but they've been involved in climate change activism, they're vegan or vegetarian, or they've made other lifestyle choices that exhibit their values. And so rather than go for a broad audience to engage them in a campaign and to get them to take practical action to engage more deeply with science and the ocean, we broke down the audience into these three segments. And for each of them, we have some specific heroes that we're going to use in videos, some specific activities we're going to engage them in, some specific webinars they're inviting them to participate in, as a way to reach that particular audience to help make a very deliberate shift in their experience of the ocean. So I think communication and who we speak to and how and for what purpose really goes to the heart of what it means to do practical action. Because as well as caring for the environment, the primary thing that we're dealing with here is humans. That's a sort of taste of a practical example of a project we're working on, that while it is primarily communications, it is also engaging them in practical action. And I'm conscious of time, so happy to talk more about some of the other examples on that theme. Yeah, I just wanted to sort of end on that question of when we're thinking about ideas and positive actions and engaging audiences and things that are practical and useful, it is profoundly important to consider, like, for who. So, you know, for me, when I started my coast care journey, it was sort of for me giving back to a place that I loved. More and more, I'm conscious of how not only my work can be good for Western Australia, but how Western Australia can be good for the world. I think that same dynamic of being very, very interested in the experience of the other humans you're working with specifically is fundamentally important to what we do in caring for the coast and the oceans. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. There were so many takeaways from there that it's hard to pinpoint one, but I felt that not everyone thinks about what is my role when you're looking out to the ocean. A lot of us love to look out to the ocean, the sunsets, enjoy the beach, but it's getting that next step of what is my role in that and working together on those needs. So thank you for your presentation. I'll pass over to Kate now, who can introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Andrew, for such an inspiring presentation. And to everyone, if you have questions still for Andrew, please remember to type them down the bottom so Andrew can answer them at the end. We're going to move on to our next speaker. Dr. Tayanah O'Donnell is an experienced science leader, communicator and collaborator, having worked in research and leadership roles in private practice, government and academia for over 15 years. She has particular expertise in environmental and public policy governance, the legal, political and cultural aspects of climate change adaptation and land use planning. Tayanah was scheduled to speak at the Coast to Coast conference in Cairns this year, which unfortunately had to be postponed. So we're very lucky to have her with us today, coming from the East Coast. If you are watching the recorded version of this forum afterwards, unfortunately you won't be able to see Tayanah's slides, as the information they contain is under agreement for an exciting book contract for Tayanah. So those are just a little bonus for those who are with us today. Without further ado, over to you, Tayanah. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. I think the most uttered words over the last 3 months are turn off mute. Thanks very much for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be joining you over on the West Coast. As mentioned, I'm over here on the East Coast and I'm in Canberra, so I'm on Ngunnawal country, and just want to explicitly acknowledge that that is the land on which I am meeting you all from. I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully that all goes according to plan. Bear with me a moment. So my presentation today, I've been evolving a little bit of what I'm going to say in response to your presentation, Andrew, which was really interesting and fascinating. And while I'll talk through a case study as part of my presentation that is very East Coast focused, because that was where I had done the research and the work, the issues that came up there are really relevant across the country. By way of background for me, Kate did a great job. Thank you, Kate. I always hate those sort of things, but I should mention for this audience that part of that work was working in environment and planning law. I'm not a lawyer anymore and I don't give legal advice anymore, but I am very interested in the legal frameworks and how the legal issues influence public policy and governance frameworks, and how, particularly at local government and to a lesser extent state government level, and how communities engage with those legal and governance mechanisms, and what that means for an iterative approach to embedding adaptive capacity, community consultation, and what it means for outcomes on the coastline in particular. I've done that work for quite a long time now, and I've done it almost everywhere in the country with the exception of Tasmania and the Northern Territory. So I'm going to try and take all of that information and make it interesting and palatable for you all in the 20 minutes that I have allotted. As you can see there, the title here, I am going to touch on a little bit of law, the exciting parts of the law, and the political and cultural elements of coastal management and coastal adaptation, as I have discovered during the last 10 years or so of research and work in this area. There we go. That's not what we need. We want that screen. So I'm hopeful that the audience over there in Perth are well familiar with the risks that our coastlines face with or without climate change. We've seen recently, and for you recently in Western Australia, some quite severe storms that are an ordinary part of life, but climate change will continue to make those storms more frequent and or more severe, depending on where you are along the Australian coastline. And it points really not only to the dire need to continually be thinking about climate change mitigation, but the reality that we are now living in, which is that climate change impacts are here. They will continue to evolve and impact different parts of where we live and in different ways over time. And we need to be thinking about not just the standard weather variation that we're used to in Australia, but how that's going to change over time. Those risks are going to change over time. And when we think about climate change, or when I think about climate change in my role at present, which is at the Australian Academy of Science, leading a program called Future Earth, I am struck by the analogy that you may have heard by now with the COVID-19 response, which is to flatten the curve. And we had a lot of dialogue around flattening the curve for COVID. And we saw quite a swift societal and political response to flattening the curve. We need to adopt that same sense of urgency and the same sense of prioritisation in flattening our emissions curve, so that we can try to better prepare for the impacts of climate change and to work as hard as we can to ensure our communities and our ecological systems are as well adapted as they can be and ready to deal with the systemic risk that is going to unfold over the coming decades. So I just want to sort of leave in your mind this idea of current and future thinking, and it relates very nicely to Andrew's point about timescales, but also that we are living in an interrelated, integrated system, and everything we do has an impact, and everything that happens in our environment in turn has its own impacts. So with those themes in mind, I'm going to delve into the case study to unpack a little bit about some of the complexities around who owns the coast, who has access to the coast, how the law shapes or facilitates or hinders even our interactions on the coast. And I'm using very broad language there because there are a number of different interest groups. I'm not going to use the word stakeholders, but some of you might prefer that framing, who have a stake in or an interest in what happens to our coastline. For those of us, you know, in the field, and I've had a look through the list, and I think I can get a sense of the audience, even though I'm coming to you via a screen from the other side of the country. We come together with a shared sense of community and protection for the coast, and enabling processes and systems that ensure intergenerational equity, and that we really protect the coastline as much as we can for future generations. But not all of the things that we do on the coast are compatible with that ideal. And indeed, our Western systems of law, overlain as they are with via colonialism, make it such that it can be very difficult to reconcile private property rights that exist under those Western systems of law with public interest ideas around accessibility to the coast, amenity to the coast, protecting the coast for its ecological value as opposed to its financial or monetary value to a private owner or developer or some other entity. So it was really with those ideas in mind that I started out on this research 10 years ago now, and my book will deal with these case studies here in New South Wales in some level of detail, and I'm going to talk through some of the common themes that come from them, just to give you a sense of the flavour and the complexity of what we're really talking about here. It's as a climate adaptation scholar, it's great to be thinking about adaptive capacity, working through vulnerability, doing risk assessments, embedding resilience, all of those things that we know we need to do. But when we come to do those, there are some really hard boundaries, legal, political, cultural, governance, others that we come up against. So let's go on a little bit of a journey down the New South Wales coast to unpack these a little bit. So here's the deep dive slide. Lots of law here, and I'm not going to go into the nitty-gritty of land use planning and coastal management law in New South Wales, except to say that it's complex, like it is in most of the country. Coastal management and land use planning is really a domain of the states. So when we need to see some coordination from the federal government, and there have been many inquiries and reports around a common or national approach to coastal management, we very quickly hit up against one of those boundaries, which is these different jurisdictional issues from state to state. In New South Wales, as is the case around the country, there's also an extra overlaying complicating factor, which is common law principles deriving from property law. All of this is all Western law. It's not Indigenous law focused here for our purposes today for this presentation. What they do, these laws, they interact in different ways, and they can sometimes create some perverse outcomes. One of those perverse outcomes was the ongoing litigation in Byron Shire Council on the northern New South Wales coastline, which resulted in dozens of different legal decisions and eventually came to a close late last year with Chief Justice Preston's judgment, which I will come to again a bit later. So you can see some statute here. We've got common law principles, there's planning rules, there's Local Government Act. There was a sea level rise policy statement which tried to embed some frameworks around how we deal with the complexity of some climate change impacts. That's now gone. And all of this was happening against this public policy backdrop of legal liability concerns primarily. And they have evolved. They've evolved to also include now financial concerns with respect to climate change risk and how different entities, public and private, think through their disclosure requirements and decision-making processes. So this idea of a fear of liability really started to drive some interesting behaviour from local and state governments all up and down the East Coast. In 2012, the Australian Productivity Commission produced its report where it examined barriers to climate change adaptation. And part of what it concluded was this uncertainty around whether local councils would be liable for particular decisions vis-a-vis the state was creating confusion around what local government could do in terms of how it was embedding adaptive capacity into land use planning rules that were trying to balance those private property rights with other interests in the coastline, as well as minimise the risk. So if to give that a practical example, if someone's house is sitting on a soft shoreline right on the coastline, there's a big storm and it falls into the sea, would the council be sued? So there were lots of questions about this and they haven't been resolved. I'm just finishing up some work now with the Victorian state government, setting out some guiding principles for local governments to make decisions around trying to avoid liability but embed climate change adaptation into their decision-making processes. So people are still thinking about this and it's created a spectrum of responses, but most of them have been at one end or the other, which is to go into overdrive and create a whole lot of risk management processes and adaptive tools and other things to aid decision making within their local areas, but sometimes hit up against some political or cultural barriers in terms of sharing those with community and or with elected councillors. Or at the other end of the spectrum, local governments have been almost so afraid about how to make a decision that they've elected to defer this future-proofing of their decision-making processes or not adequately consider climate change in their processes as they're making decisions. So they've just chosen to put it off and ignore it. Neither of those are really ideal outcomes, but if you're going to be at one end of the spectrum, it's probably better to be a little bit over-prepared than it is to be under-prepared. just touching on the new Act in New South Wales, this took 2 years to eventually pass through the New South Wales Parliament, but it's an interesting and I think useful example of how legislation can incorporate different interests to try and balance how we ensure that people can use their private title for the highest and best use at particular points in time, how we can manage the ecosystem values and services that we need, particularly in a coastal context, how we try to deal with past legacy issues. So those people who have built on soft shore lines right on the coastline possibly would not be approved now, depending on the jurisdiction, and increasingly that's becoming apparent. But they were approved at a point in time. So how do we deal with those people who are still living there and still have a right to be there? And then how do we interweave ideas of intergenerational equity, sustainable development principles, and a range of tools for local government to really put land use planning at the forefront in making these decisions? And it's been tested recently in, just going to look up the name of the case, bear with me, Ralph Lauren and the New South Wales Transitional Coastal Panel was the decision I referred to earlier, where the Chief Justice Preston of the New South Wales Land and Environment Court handed down a decision that says, under this new Act, there is a need to interpret land use planning laws quite particularly, and they will be interpreted to ensure public access and public amenity to beaches. And this was with respect to the litigation in Byron Shire Council, which hopefully for that council has now come to an end. A lot of my work, when I'm wearing my academic hat, involves a lot of ethnographic work with different communities all along the coast, from Queensland right through to Victoria. And I just want to show this example here in the Eurobodalla Shire Council, which is on the south coast of New South Wales. This is a council that was also severely impacted by the East Coast bushfires that you may be aware of, that occurred on this side of the country in December, but particularly in January. And it's important to mention the fires because when we think about coastal management, we often look outward towards the sea and to the ocean, but it's equally important that we turn and look inward to the land and how we're treating and working with the land. Some of these communities, and even down into Victoria, there's one road in and out. When a fire like the fires that we had come through, there is nowhere to go and no ability, in my view, to really scenario plan or forward plan for catastrophic fires of that nature. Whole power grids, excuse me, were wiped out. People did not have access to phones for a number of days. People panicked and bought food. And I'm saying that now because, and it's not so much of a shock because we've just seen that with people's response to COVID and the economic shutdown across the country there. But for the South Coast, where there was no way to get information in or out, no one knew when there was going to be petrol or food or road access, it was a very serious issue. And the local governments here were really quite constrained in terms of how to manage all of those different things happening at the same time. So this one, though, is not so much affected by fire because these sticks in the sand here represent a old system common law private property title, and the person who owns this residential parcel of land has put those sticks in the beach to stop people from walking on his land. And just off the screen to your right, you will see there that he's put a garden bed in, and behind that is some small buildings, relocatable buildings, but buildings that he's living in. This person and his parents, who are now passed away, have been on this parcel of land for about 35 years. He won't move. Council can't afford to buy it at standard market rates. So this idea of market-led adaptation is really problematic. And I'm in those papers that were on an earlier slide, I'm really quite critical of it because it creates perverse outcomes like this one, where you have a person who has nowhere to go, no family, is refusing to leave, is at significant risk. So when the tide comes in, the tide comes fairly close to where they're living. The local government want to buy back the land and make it a park so that it's less risk to them. And the state government are very reluctant to step in and help, because if they start resuming land like in this manner, then they'll set a precedent for other properties along the coast. So it's highly political and very cultural in terms of this person's attachment to this place. And I don't know that the sticks really work all that well, but people were respecting this boundary that they'd put up. Some of the work I've done, particularly with residents, has led to some interesting results. This photo is Port Stephens, an area in Port Stephens. It's an ordinary king tide, nothing particularly exciting, but people like to get out there and watch the water come very close to the properties. I put this photo here to show you the difference in housing type. So the immediate house to the right of the screen, you can see that there is a concrete floor to that house, and that goes all the way through that house, because on the other side of these homes is a small road and then a protected wetland. This is a soft shoreline, it's all sand, and the houses that were here, and thinking about those past legacy issues, were all built in this way. They were essentially fishermen shacks that allowed the water to come through, and then it would recede depending on the time of year. Since then, particularly in the last 30 years, you can see these houses back here. I'm showing with my arrow. I'm not sure if it's coming up on the shared screen, but these are new, in the background there, these are new developments. They take up most, if not all, of the land parcel. They're built on a concrete slab, and people who own properties here have very mixed views about whether or not the council should require new development to have a raised floor level and or have a ground floor that allows water to move in and out so that they can adapt to the local weather and climate change impacts as these sort of king tide events just become part of the norm. So I've done a range of interviews and work with residents in Port Stephens and in Lake Macquarie, and the view is interesting. They don't want any government intervention where it will have a negative impact on their property in any way, but they expect the government to intervene when there might be some sort of damage done to their property. So if there's a storm coming, yes, we want the government to put in a seawall or some sort of emergency protection works, but don't do it if it's going to impede my view, or don't put planning rules in place if it's going to make it difficult for me to redevelop this land at some point in the future. It's probably not all that unexpected given general human behaviour, but there it is nonetheless. Now, I've just got an eye on the time as well, so I'm going to touch very briefly on the litigation in Byron Shire that I've mentioned a couple of times. You can see just down here on this map, these houses here have all in various ways either jointly or separately been involved in litigation against Byron Shire Council with respect to a rock wall or a seawall that they wanted built to protect the coastline from increasing erosion events. And there were disputes about who should pay for that, what kind of wall it should be, if anything, whether or not these houses were even meant to be here in the first place, what the impacts were going to be on Belongil Creek and the wet system that sits behind these developments, and a whole range of other things that came through there. And you can see here, I love showing this photo because it shows all the different types of law that are colliding together in this, very politically contested environment at the time. The lighting's a little bit dull, but this sign says Byron Councillor's erosion policy sucks. And there was at the time, and for a number of years, a very sustained effort to try and discredit the councillors who were really trying to embed climate change adaptation thinking and policies and capacity building across their suite of coastal management policies. You can see this sign up here that says, this is Crown land, so the access to the beach is managed by the Crown. And local government up here have, got their sign saying don't come in because there's been a big storm. And this is an area where you see a lot of coastal activities and storm events. So it's a high risk location in terms of coastal management. And this particular image from 2016, I don't know if this made the news over on your side of the country, but it was a big deal over here. And I show it because it symbolises the challenges between local and state governments and private property owners, particularly in very built up high density areas like this one. It's further complicated by the fact that these houses on the lower North Shore of Sydney have a high net value. And so people come to the debate with a different view than they might have, say, if this had happened to a caravan park on a floodplain. Nonetheless, these are people's private properties. There were people who bought these houses, were on the news crying that evening, someone's dog's ashes washed out to sea. You can see that there's a pool fallen down onto the coast there. And that's challenging for people. I think it's hard for the public eye, though, to rouse any sense of sympathy because of the high net value of these houses. But I would hesitate to put a blanket approach over that. The complexity of one's place in the world is important to not lose sight of when we're thinking about coastal management. And yes, these houses shouldn't be here, in my view, but they've been there for a long time. And when they were put there, we didn't know what we know now about climate change. So what do we do? These houses are there. There's a main road, Pittwater Road, behind them, and then the sprawl of Sydney that goes on forever. So we can't push them back like we could perhaps in Byron Bay, notwithstanding the political challenges there. The government can't afford to pay, or perhaps they can afford it, but they won't pay, several millions of dollars per house to buy these homes out. And if they did, would we as taxpayers be happy with that decision? Local government have tried to build a seawall here, but no one can agree, or no one could agree before this, on who should pay for it or what kind of wall it should be. So we have this, and then you have, newspaper articles like this one. And at the time, I can't do it on the slide, but you could put your cursor over the middle here and slide it across to see the before and after and the value of these homes at the time. So there was this public discourse around, well, why should we protect people who know about the risk? Thank you. And when does the state have a role, and when does local government have a role in responding to these issues? And in the immediate aftermath of this disaster, state, local government and the community here seem to be on the same page after 20 years of disagreeing about what wall should be there, if any. And people thought, this is interesting. This is a highly conflicted place, but maybe they'll agree on what to do with this particular location. But they've not agreed. They're still in court trying to work it out. And here, yes, 2 more slides to go and then I'll finish. Here I just want to show a different lens over some of the issues and challenges here that we're thinking of. This is Tweed Shire. And this is, if you're an engineer, if there are any engineers in the room, you will look at this wall and be marvelled. At least I was. I'm not an engineer, but I looked at this and thought it was quite incredible. But at the same time, this is a fairly significant manipulation of the local environment in an area. So this is Kingscliff. A lot of sand gets moved from Kingscliff and sent around to the Gold Coast to replenish the beach there. So it's an area that is subject to a lot of man-made or human intrusion to the natural system already. And a decision was made to build this seawall underneath the sand rather, and indeed the sea even when it's a king tide, to help protect the main street, which is off to the left of the screen here. So there's a surf club, which is where I'm standing when I took this photo. There's a caravan park and then the main road of Kingscliff. And then right down the other end there, and you can sort of see the building there, is the bowling club. So the stretch of this wall is about 300 metres, and they've buried it down about between 4 to 8 metres down. So it's very deep, very long, cost about $5 million, I'm told, all up. But they've stepped it. So you can see here these steps that they're building, and that's a person, just to give a sense of the scale of this wall. And the logic behind this was to created a seawall that would not only protect those assets, local council and I think even state government assets in this instance, but also create a public space where if the sand has completely eroded, people can come and sit on these concrete steps with their fish and chips, or if they want to look at mermaids or whatever else, they can come here and do that. So they've created a beach system that serves multiple purposes. And if I were an engineer, I would think that was really great. But the lawyer in me was quite concerned, given that that's concrete, and if, you know, a little bit's exposed and someone bangs their head on it, then that to me screams liability. And I thought we were really concerned about liability. So that's the first thing. But secondly, as what I'd like to think as a person existing in this system that, you know, we all live in together, the environmental intrusion of something like this is quite significant. And I'm not convinced that this will do anything once sea level starts to rise anyway. So we've spent all of this money, we've manipulated the environment in a particular way to protect some assets for an unknown period of time, probably no more than 30, 40, 50 years, given current trajectories for climate change. So it's an interesting one. So all of that, and I didn't have time to really delve into the theory or ideas of thinking around this term lawscape that I use to describe all of this, but basically what I'm saying is this is really complicated. The politics, the legal frameworks, how we work through different cultural perspectives, and what public policy means over scale and time is complex, and a way to think about that is to think about it through this lens of lawscape. I'm going to leave it there because I know I'm out of time, and that was about 2/3 of what I was going to say at the Coastal Conference, squished into 20 minutes. So please ask me any questions as you wish.
Thank you, Tayanah. I understand you could probably talk for hours on this topic, and thank you for painting that picture. I fully see the same issues with COVID happened, and we had this systemic change, this urgency, and how do we get that same change and urgency on climate change? Your presentation has fueled some chat, so we definitely have some questions for you.
I'll have a look at the chat and put myself on mute.
No worries. So I'll read them out as well so that people can hear what's been said. But in WA, we have the Ocean Reef Marina development, and I'll read this word for word what one of our coast carers, he is the coordinator for Friends of Ocean Reef and Aluka Foreshore, and he's been really involved in being part of a community committee on this development. So he's written Ocean Reef Marina development where 1.2 kilometres of cliffs will be dozed into the sea over the top of WA's richest abalone reef. So a housing estate can be built over what was once ocean. Then build a 7 to 8 metre high seawall to protect the houses, which probably won't be able to get insurance. My question is if there's a way we can stop this type of madness. I sign petitions, sometimes write letters or phone politicians, and share on Facebook, write blogs, etc. But more and more madness is happening. Also, the oil off Ningaloo Reef. I understand aiming at people on the curve who might move their attitude, but some of these things are happening so fast. It's an emergency. What can we do?
Yeah, great question. What a horrifying example. That example is an example of everything that should not be happening, in my view, on the coastline, and those poor people who will, not be aware or don't care about the risks will buy there and then will be at risk. It's madness. What can we do? I think there's value in still engaging at the federal government level for some national leadership and coordination of these issues, but really the remit of land use planning, which is probably one of the stronger tools in this space, is with state governments. And the pressure points need to be put on state governments Even though I'm doing the work for DELP down in Victoria, I've said to them very plainly, you know, state governments have gotten away with a fair amount over the last 5 years in particular, but even 10, where responsibility has been pushed right down to local government level. Local councils have varying degrees of resource and expertise and ability to be able to deal with these really complex issues. And yet there they are working with communities trying to figure all this, all this stuff out. So politically and in an advocacy sense, I think state and federal governments need to continually be made aware of the challenge of this. And that's with or without climate change. You know, the development that was just described there is a high-risk development, irrespective of climate change impacts. COVID has been a little bit of a wake-up call in terms of how humans and our natural world interact and the delicate balance that is to be had there, and that we are not as superior as perhaps we always think we are, explicitly or implicitly. But it's also had the impact of drawing attention away from what was a disastrous summer and how important it was, particularly for Australia, given how vulnerable we are and how variable our natural climate is anyway, to really take seriously the climate change projections, what those climate risks are, the uncertainty in terms of when and how severe the impacts will be, and what that means for our children and grandchildren. So I wish I had more of an answer other than lobby government, because government needs a good swift kick sometimes. But at the same time, within government, people working within the bureaucracy of government, in my experience at least, almost all of them get it completely, and they're working so hard on trying to embed good decision-making practices and adaptive capacity for communities at various scales. So I think if we can, you know, put the pressure politically on ministers and others, but also recognise inside of government that a lot of people are trying to do a lot of good work. The oil situation off Ningaloo and further up the Burrup expansion, I just, just where do you start? Where do you start with that?
We did share a link before. It is open to public comment at the moment, and there is some real, if you get a lot of public comment, you can get change, but you need people to start actually commenting. You can care about it, but to make that comment definitely sees action, as it shows what community values really are.
Absolutely. And I think what they're doing up there too is separating out the project. So if anyone is making a comment, I think what they're doing up there is separating out the project into different stages so that they can move around the environmental impact assessment requirements. So perhaps some of the comments need to be around ensuring that those impact assessment processes are as thorough as they can be, as well as recognising, you know, Indigenous cultural significance and all the other complexity that's at play up there.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Tayanah. And I'd like to ask Andrew as well about this question. And I just want to let everyone know that we were finishing at 12:30, but we can push through that. We will record it, so if anyone needs to leave us, you'll be able to watch back later, but we can push through as long as our presenters are happy to stay and keep discussing. So Andrew, with a little bit more of a perspective on adaptation specialisation and maybe some examples, could you give us a bit more comment on that question?
Yeah, so Don and everyone else who's tackling issues at a local level, be encouraged. I think it's also significant to understand that this is going, it won't stop. Like sea level rise won't stop. It's like we have hundreds of years of it locked in. And I don't think anyone, even I, have really gotten the depth of that. Like even in the report that I authored, we cited even in Australia, there's like 63, this is in 2009, there's $63 billion worth of coastal assets at risk. Currently there's, well, I'm just looking at the figures here, about 570 cities are going to be affected by sea level change and rising storm surges. It is, I think it's actually incomprehensible, because we're looking at levels of sea level rise that are accelerating over the next sort of couple of decades that previously took 10,000 years or longer to occur. And it's critically important to, fight your local battles, but also to recognize, like, this is a profoundly challenging cultural, economic, social, ecological challenge, and that most of our coastline in Western Australia will go. Like, it will go. Like, if you do the measurements on sea level rise and how far it's going to go back, within a generation, it is going to be, it's going to be gone and eroded. And so one of the things about adaptation specialization is recognizing the degree to which that requires, like, massive sort of interdisciplinary efforts, but also whether you're fighting it or whether you're proposing something, to start to think in decadal and century timeframes. I know that doesn't sort of, perhaps it may change the way you relate to the action you're taking immediately, and with which audiences you want to build alliances and what sort of a vision you're aiming for. But yeah, there's loads of short-term battles that are urgent that need to be fought, but do leave some time and energy for thinking, okay, what's a good outcome over decades and centuries? And there are some inspiring examples. Again, I sort of won't go through them in detail, I'm conscious of time, but in the report from around the world, there are very, very creative responses to, and highly different responses to sea level rise in other nations compared to Australia, but also very diverse responses in how people who are not happy with the use of infrastructure solutions, like you referred to, John, about what they're doing to shift the perspective and political perspectives on that. So,
brilliant. Thank you for that perspective, Andrew. Just so we can capture the participants we still have with us, we'll run through a Mentimeter session, but keep those questions coming in the Q&A and we'll come back to more discussion. So we've got a few statements here. If you could take a moment to, it's a sliding scale of how much you agree with these statements. So 1 is strongly disagree, 5 is strongly agree. We're starting to see some answers come up. All right. So we've had about half the people log on and answer. We'll give it a little while for those bars to move and get some more answers. While we're getting that, we'll come back to, in the Q&A, I've got another comment from Don that says, one problem is that these projects are often planned and decided quite a few years ago based on now out-of-date social values and economic times. For example, the WA mining boom has been over for years and people are no longer buying boats. Tayanah, perhaps you could comment on that as to the legalities around placing value on current timelines rather than historical.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not sure that's a legal question. I think that's more a political and certainly a market question. And part of the reason why I'm so critical of the idea that the market will solve all of our problems or answer all of our prayers. In the context of land use planning, you're right, there is a planning pipeline, and in some states it can even be longer than that. It can be up to 10 years. So a decision is made, a plan is developed, a new suburb is going to be built, and then, you know, a process starts where they clear the land, and then eventually, usually right at the end, you might get some public transport and public infrastructure. And you get that at the end because everyone has moved in and they've started paying their rates. So the government says, well, now we can put in the bus or the train or the pool or whatever it is because we can afford to do it. So it's a very economic rationalist approach, and a very, you know, sort of market-led, let's see what the demand is before we invest in a place. And we're kind of, society broadly is operating on that trajectory, and we've kind of constructed this world where, not kind of, we have, I think, constructed a world where that is, you know, becoming untenable. You know, we're complacent about it. You know, there's a demand that we consume things and then more things will be built. So it's not a health and well-being led way of governing or putting processes in place to help society function. It's very much a individualistic, where what's the economic rationalisation for making a decision, and then we'll invest in it, and then we'll come at it that way. So I don't know what the answer is. Some might say overthrow capitalism. That's too simplistic, and we're not going to do that either. The land use planning system is a tool for embedding adaptive capacity and encouraging people to think about climate change risk in a more systemic way is limited for that reason. I think that's probably the number one reason why it is limited. There's that time delay. But it's where most people come together in the same space, you know, at almost the same time. And so if you're trying to build, you know, if you're trying to build capacity and embed adaptive thinking, then the land use planning system is as close as you can get, but it's certainly not without its flaws.
Absolutely. And Andrew, you spoke before about this 4-tier system of solutions, products, markets, and values. Could you apply that to this example? Yeah,
that's a good lead in. So one of the things is to, like, you can just fight what's happening now, or you could maybe recognize that these things play out over years and decades and decide that you're going to be in it for a decade or two, and try and get in front of it in terms of the way that you embody and work with others to grow a community of people that share values that are adaptive, so that are an expression of the truth of us needing to adapt to climate changes over years and decades. So yeah, practically that may shift the attention of your community group, both fighting things that are urgent, but also being sure that you're doing the visioning and creating alternative that looks years and decades into the future, that's more attractive than the crappy one that people make up when they're just thinking of themselves and how to build more houses and spend $195 million worth of subsidies that just went to the housing industry, like with a snap of a finger. So that's one thing, is to sort of get in front of it positively. The other is to, yes, look at markets. So the whole land use planning system and the motivation to continue building houses is underpinned by, like, market drivers. And I won't go into all the details there, but there's huge sort of incentives in Western Australia, as I just mentioned, to keep building houses and keep building them further out. And there's an intervention that perhaps even comes prior to law about what we value and how things are valued. In terms of products, there are people doing really interesting things with different types of seawalls or different types of, you know, how are we going to protect the coast that are perhaps require less bulldozers and they're more adaptive. And the other one, which is like having a competition for solutions. So Western Australia, as acknowledged by recent media articles and reports on the total value of coastal adaptation that's going to need to happen. I mean, I'll talk about one project in particular, which is if the next 50 years of sea level rise, there's a chance that in Perth that could happen in the next 8 years. And if that got to the Kwinana Freeway, imagine the economic impact of that. So one of the proposals were to build like a $200 to $500 million basically gate on the Swan River to stop the sea level rise taking out the Kwinana Freeway, right? Now, if you want to...
I'll stop you there, but let you go on afterwards. We'll just move on to the next Mentimeter question so we can move through it. Just as a comment on how we saw that, we will release these Mentimeter results as well so people can gauge that. So our next one is pick the 3 funding opportunities that you could see needing funding. So have a look at these and answer them. And Andrew, if you want to finish that example there, go for it.
Yeah, so there's recognising that we have to do a lot of coastal adaptation. We're going to spend a ton of money on it as a state. It could be of interest to essentially run like a competition for the best solutions. Currently, what we have is individual engineers in individual local governments in individual situations coming up with solutions within their existing paradigm and what they know. And there's very little involvement from people from different disciplines with different ideas, different perspectives, and there's no market incentive for anyone else to get in there because it's a pretty closed process of like, oh, we've got this coastal problem, we must need an engineering solution. So there are examples of running a competition, say at a state level, of like, what are creative ways that we adapt to sea level change? Or what are creative ways that we can live by the coast? And there's more than enough budget across Western Australia that's going to be devoted to coastal adaptation, that a competition like that could be very, very worthwhile doing for the participants and the innovators as well as the government.
Brilliant. And looking at what we've got on our screen now and looking at funding, which is a good link in, we're starting to see these bulls head over to where we think funding should sit. And it's looking like there's an overwhelming answer of coastal managers. And we can see that in, at least in NRM, where coastal funding doesn't come from federal funding anymore. And Perth NRM are putting funding in to keep our coastal program going. NAC has just found more funding to get their coastal officers back. But in other NRM regions, they're lacking that coastal manager role that really supported the community groups. So it's looking like that's an overwhelming answer. We also have youth engagement, which is something that perhaps we could have another comment from you, Andrew, about maybe recruitment and engagement, just looking at where people are thinking about funding opportunities.
Yeah, did you want me to say a little bit about that now?
Yeah.
Yep, so it's a super important thing for the demographic we're targeting in that campaign, 15 to 24-year-olds, is what's relevant and meaningful to them.
Yep.
And it may be sort of that they're interested in what's happening with their career, they're making like decisions about what social groups they're going to be part of, what they study, etc. But finding a way to communicate with that demographic, if you're looking at them, about what do they care about, like what's relevant and what matters to them. And that would mean you'd have to go and talk to them. You'd have to genuinely be interested in what they want, not just what you want from them. And then to engage with them in something that is much, much bigger than you and themselves. Much, much, much bigger. And that can involve friends and something that generates a sense of social identity. So it's both practically how it's relevant, but there's also inviting them into something that is inspiring, positive, that is an alternative narrative to the stuff they're getting in their social media feeds, which is probably dominantly depressing. And that puts them in a position of being the ones that you are inviting to work with them to create a better world in whichever way you are. So, and also, you know, like make it engaging and practical and experiential. Yeah, it may just be a different frame on what you're doing, but it genuinely needs to start with understanding their experience and perspective and what's relevant and important to them, including like what time of day they want to hear that message and what medium they want to hear it from and who they want to hear it from. And it may not be you, but you may be able to work with people that they want to hear from to communicate to them at times they want to hear it. Thanks.
Absolutely. And for people wanting to know more about that, we probably don't have time to talk on it, but for National Science Week, Andrew is helping out and they're teeing up ocean heroes with people that are able to talk to the community, whether it's from art or sport, things like that. So have a look at the National Science Week videos coming out in August. And just to make one more note on what we're seeing here in terms of funding, we've got 0 people on the hard measures, so those seawalls and things like that. So it looks like we have an answer here. We'll move to the next one. And I'm aware that Tayanah will be leaving us soon. So as we move into the next question, which is to rank these coastal issues, you've got a number of them there, and in your Mentimeter, you'll be able to select your first, second, third, and submit that at the end. As these come up, Tayanah, do you have some last comments that you'd like to share?
Thanks, Hannah. I would like to say something which dovetails very nicely into what Andrew was just talking about, which is that despite the complexity and despite the challenges that we have currently and ahead of us, it's really important to remain optimistic and to continually come at this with messages of hope, because what we're really talking about is our children and grandchildren's futures. And it will be challenging, but I'm always optimistic about the cleverness of the human race and its ability, our ability, to really think outside the box when we really need to. So yes, it's hard. We might lose all of our coastline, but I implore everybody to remain hopeful and come at this with that, hopeful spirit.
Thank you, Tayanah. And we're starting to see, we've got 5 answers on this now. I understand it takes a bit of time to look at the issues and to rank them. We're already seeing a few. So out of those 5, it looks like coastal erosion and inundation are coming up pretty high, which matches the sense of urgency that's needed as to that issue. As we're seeing it switch between as well, we definitely have funding and coordination up there, which almost come hand in hand. We've lost coordination with funding for coastal managers. So those two come hand in hand as well. We've got 8 now, so everyone keep on posting your options.
Just going to add to what Tayanah said, if that's okay. Yeah, just like at the core of, like, even with the Mentimeter polls and what we've talked about today, quite a lot of it has been focused on like what we perceive to be problems and fixing problems or addressing risks. And I have infinite faith in humans' ability to be creative about solutions. But I think a lot of attention can be directed towards sort of the other end of the horizon, which is what is our ability to turn what we love and what cares for us into the foundations for our relating to each other and the environment. And I think at the core of whatever you're doing with coast care, it's coastal caring. It's not coastal battling. And I think it's some profoundly important about sharing your love for the environment, for that plant, for that special moment, for the breathlessness of being underwater. Like whatever it is, I cannot overstate how important it is to not always be fighting, not always be angry, not always be against things, not always think it's someone else's problem. But it is the future of humanity on this earth will depend on our ability to not just keep doing that, but rather sort of get ahead of ourselves in how we think long term in the expression of our love for the coast and each other. It's a big, I'm trying to say something, it's like quite a big deal, but it's like the problem may be that we're obsessed with problems. And I just encourage you not to fall into that trap.
Absolutely. There's something to be said with positive action rather than reacting negatively. Dr. Tayanah O'Donnell will have to leave us now, but a massive thank you for taking part in this forum and answering questions. We will take more questions, and we might send something on to you if you're open to it. But
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Please feel free to reach out, and thanks again for having me.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Take care.
Everyone else, we are still going. We can push this on a bit longer, so we'd love for you to stay on if you can. We're starting to see some more people come into this ranking of coastal issues, but we're going to move on to where do you see opportunities to recruit community into coastal conservation? And this is one where you can type your answer in. And it's sort of, so in community, there's lots of different sectors, you could say. And if there's ones that you've struggled to connect with, you see an opportunity, write it in here. And as they come up, it comes back to that recruitment and looking at people's values. So I guess as they come up, Andrew and I can comment on how we might be able to seize those opportunities. So just thinking about it now, is there an opportunity that you could see, Andrew, that often doesn't get thought of?
Yeah. So one of them is the like there's something there in that language which is coastal conservation. And conservation already assumes that there's something there that needs to be protected against or preserved. And there can be a different language about what do we want to grow in terms of, you know, growing people's interest through just monitoring, as in they love doing science and they love learning more. So it's like coastal learning. Or it could be about coastal caring expression. So someone in the comment mentioned something about art, etc. And there's also things like coastal litigation. So I would expand perhaps the not just coastal conservation in the way that you may be used to it, but thinking of all the different ways that different types of people may be able to contribute towards a positive vision. And that may expand. You may be able to recruit journalists or graffiti artists or builders, rather than just people that like planting plants in dunes, or that like writing letters to council, or that like attending committee meetings as an expression of their caring. So that's just one thought off the bat with a blank slate.
Yeah, absolutely. And just turning my attention to the Q&A, we did have one comment saying from Merrily saying, I am 61. A lot of ignorance and denial does come from older people. I feel I am too old to engage with youth, but need ways to connect with older people. Could you comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say connect with older people that you like and grow an alliance for something that you want to do with them together. I wouldn't bother with the people that are old and powerless and grumpy and that are doing things that you don't like. I'm not sort of denigrating those other people. I'm just saying don't hang out with them if it's sapping your life energy. But go and hang out with people your age or otherwise that have aligned values and build something together that's amazing. And, you know, if someone's really being an idiot and a problem and they have a lot of power, then go and take them out one way or another. You know, if that's, I'm not saying, you know, in any way other than if they're causing a problem that is affecting, you know, your and the community's wider vision of a better relationship to the environment, and they're sort of, you know, play by the rules of whatever games there are, legal or otherwise, but just reduce their power and influence. Yeah, but do that with a team of friends. So yeah, I'd suggest find other people that energize and inspire you and connect with them doing things that you love.
Absolutely. And just to read out these opportunities that have been seen by our participants, we've got schools and other community groups, lobbying the schools and local newspapers, Coastal Waste Warriors, which is based down in Mandurah, is aimed at plastic in ocean and has done really well in their area. Other groups focus on plants and get rid of invasive plants, etc. And they want to focus more on what is alive and beautiful under the ocean. So it's focusing on the positive, but attacking the problem. Great. Social media, schools, social clubs, so sporting and businesses for sure. And there's a comment saying that recognizing that short-term engagement may best suit some people rather than generally seeking long-term commitment. So moving on to the next one, we're opening up to questions again. We will be probably cutting it off in about 5 minutes. So any burning questions that you have now, write them, get them in. I'm just going to scroll through the chat. There was a couple of comments I picked up. I'll just read a couple of nice comments that we have. Tayanah wrote to end and step out. We are all in this together. Thanks a lot, everyone, for having me. Creating your vision for a more beautiful and just world. A challenge for all of us on this meeting is that there are so many issues out there that organisations are trying to engage people on. Post-care and climate change are just some of those. So there's more, there's always more to talk about, and it just goes to show that we could focus on so many different topics here. So a question's come through. Can we link up and continue support with this meeting group? So I can answer to that straight away. With Perth NRM, we do provide a network, and in terms of the coastal community, we have been recently working with, collaborating with Coastwest, so Southwest and Peel, the Australian Coastal Society, WA chapter, and we've been supported by lots of the different interested parties. These come from government departments, WUMSI and WABSI, and the Department of Transport, as well as Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, who all have some interest in the coast. So we'll be rolling out more to do with this network. Andrew, do you have something to add in terms of meeting up with groups and groups that you've heard of? Collaborating and connecting?
Yeah, if you're interested in the For Blue, there's a couple of hundred people who are part of our community, and that is, focused mostly on the marine and oceans. But as I mentioned, there is this stuff around oceanic identity, about coastal adaptation, about ecological stewardship, and yeah, we have newsletters and forums and everything like that.
Brilliant. And that's something we'll keep that question maybe as a feedback question for later to see where those networks are, because that's something in creating a collaborative approach to this. Tayanah put it really well in saying it was an interrelated and integrated system, and everything moves forward faster and with true action when you have collaboration. So that's a really, really brilliant question to continue that topic. So we'll leave the questions up. So if you have one, say it now or rest in peace. And we'll say a huge thank you again to Tayanah, who's moved on. Thank you so much for your painting a picture of things that we don't always understand, and being able to communicate that with others in the community. Andrew, thank you for inspiring yet again ways that we can look into bringing a system that involves solutions, products, markets, and especially that value. So looking at our community and the values and focusing on that positive values, seeing positive action. So a huge thank you to everyone for coming, for participating. This has been recorded and we'll get it up on our website in a week or so. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and be sure to contact us with any questions. Check out the Perth NRM website, www.perthnrm.com, and Facebook for upcoming events. Andrew, would you like to say anything to sign off?
No, just thank you. And thank you for all the people that are involved in coast care activities that, it's people like you that affected people like me that quite profoundly. And so, you never know what will be the positive impact of your action. So I encourage you to continue it. Thank you.
Absolutely. And that's the perfect way to round off. We'll see you out on the coast.